Elizabeth Carter had always known that her life would be tied to dance. From an early age, she dedicated every minute to training, perfecting every movement until it was flawless, eventually becoming the prima ballerina of the New York theater. Throughout her career, she performed on the world's most prestigious stages, her name appearing on posters alongside the greatest artists. But the stage is no place for eternity. When the body begins to betray you with the weariness of years of work, even the greatest must say goodbye to the spotlight. Elizabeth retired with a light heart. She saw herself as happy and at peace, surrounded by young talents to whom she could pass on her knowledge. In pursuit of this dream, she opened a dance studio in Brooklyn. It was a place where dreams floated in the air, where music and art fused with youthful energy. But for Elizabeth, the studio was more than just a business or a way to pass the time. It was her new home, her sanctuary. The studio became a gathering place for kids from all walks of life. There were children from wealthy families who arrived in brand new outfits, stepping out of shiny SUVs, and those who came on foot, dressed modestly, but with the same burning passion for dance. Elizabeth didn't make distinctions. Every child was a treasure to her, and she valued each one deeply. Talent doesn't know wealth or poverty, she loved to say. It's born where it's meant to be. Among the students was a boy named Jason. He walked into the studio one autumn day, barefoot, wearing a jacket far too thin for the cold. His movements were awkward, but his eyes shone with passion. Elizabeth immediately saw potential in him. She spent countless hours teaching him the basics, helping him build his confidence. Day by day, Jason got better. Soon, it became clear, this boy was special. His body seemed made for dance, and his soul burned with a fire. He trained with such determination that he outshone even the most privileged kids in the studio, and yet he remained humble, grateful, and always looked to Elizabeth as his mentor. "You have a great future ahead of you," she told him one day. "I see a star in you." But fate had other plans. One day, while Jason was rehearsing a difficult spin, he slipped. It all happened in an instant. The sound of his fall, the cry of pain. When he was rushed to the hospital, the diagnosis was clear. A severe leg fracture. The doctors warned that Jason's dance career was now over. Elizabeth remembered that day as if it had happened yesterday. She sat by his hospital bed, holding his hand. "Don't give up," she told him. "Dance isn't just about the stage, it's about the soul. You can find yourself in something else, but your love for art will always be a part of you." Her words gave Jason strength during his toughest moment. But for Elizabeth, it was a blow. She felt responsible for his dreams and their destruction. Elizabeth didn't just help Jason and her students. She believed that humanity was not just a trait, but a way of life. Her studio became a kind of sanctuary of kindness. She often set out a kettle for the homeless who sometimes wandered into the yard. On the cold steps of the dance studio, they found temporary shelter. "No one deserves to freeze in this world," she would say. Her neighbors sometimes gave her disapproving looks. "Why let those people in?" they would whisper. But Elizabeth paid no attention. She saw in every person, no matter how lost they seemed, the possibility of a new chapter. As time passed, Elizabeth's studio became more than just a place to dance. It was a space where kids learned how to be kind, resilient, and generous. She taught them the art of dance, but more importantly, she taught them the art of life. Her story was just beginning. She didn't yet know what challenges lay ahead. Challenges that could break anyone. But Elizabeth was a ballerina not just on the stage. She was one in her soul, gracefully and powerfully overcoming every challenge life threw at her. This new stage of her life was her real dance, the dance of a new beginning. Elizabeth Carter's life was going on as usual. Her dance studio, despite all the challenges, kept running. She had no family except for one relative, her nephew George. He was the son of her sister, who had passed away a few years ago. Feeling responsible, Elizabeth helped George with his education, gave him money to start his life. But despite all this care, he rarely visited his aunt, and their relationship remained distant. As she grew older, Elizabeth began to notice her strength slipping away. The spark that once drove her was now replaced by caution. Sometimes it was hard for her to stand at the ballet for long periods or check complex movements. But even as she aged, she continued to inspire her students. Dance was her life's purpose, and as long as she had the studio, she felt needed. The day began like any other. In the morning, Elizabeth taught a class for the younger group, then met with the parents of a few students. As she was about to leave, she grabbed a small box with some leftover props and headed home. When she climbed the familiar steps to her old apartment building, a strange feeling washed over her. The door to her apartment was slightly ajar. "That's odd," she thought, nudging the door with her shoulder. What she saw inside made her freeze. All the furniture had been dismantled or thrown away. Instead of the familiar coziness of her home, there was chaos. In the middle of the room, there were strangers. One man, about 30, was inspecting the walls, while another was loudly talking on the phone, standing by the window. Their expressions were indifferent, as if they were the rightful owners of the place. "What's going on here?" Elizabeth's voice trembled, but she tried to stay calm. "Oh, Aunt Elizabeth," came George's voice from behind her. She turned around and saw her nephew standing in the doorway with a wide, self-satisfied grin. "George, what does this mean?" she asked, her growing anxiety tightening in her chest. George walked closer and spread his arms as if explaining something obvious. "You see, Aunt, I sold the apartment. You were here all alone, and I found buyers. Now you can find something more modest," he said, as if discussing a trivial matter. Elizabeth took a step back, as if she had been struck. You can't do this," she whispered, feeling a cold horror wash over her. "This apartment belongs to me." George frowned, his tone sharpening. "It belonged to you. I've taken care of all the paperwork. Honestly, you'd better get used to the idea that it's time to move on." The people in the room exchanged glances, as if this scene made them uncomfortable, but no one came to Elizabeth's defense. George grabbed her by the elbow and started guiding her toward the door. "You'd better leave now. I don't have time for a long talk. No one's waiting for you anyway," he said with a cold smile. Elizabeth didn't even resist. The shock of what was happening was so overwhelming that she let him practically push her out the door. The man on the phone, without pausing his conversation, closed the door behind her, and just like that, the chapter she had considered her life in that apartment ended. Outside, Elizabeth felt the ground slipping out from under her. Where could she go? What was she supposed to do? She shuddered at the gust of wind and wrapped her coat tighter around herself. The box with the props was still in her hands, an absurd symbol of her past. She wandered to the nearest park, sat on a bench, and for the first time in years, broke down in tears. Her shoulders shook as she cried, while passers-by avoided looking in her direction, quietly walking by. She covered her face with her hands, trying to make sense of how this could have happened. Elizabeth remembered how many years ago, when George was still a young student, she had helped him. She paid for his housing, helped him get out of debt, was always there when he needed support. In her eyes, he was still that boy she held by the hand at his mother's funeral. But that George, the one she knew, no longer existed. "How could I have been so wrong?" she thought. The pain of betrayal was unbearable, but she couldn't even blame George out loud. She just didn't know where to begin. Time passed, but no one approached to ask if she needed help. The sun slowly sank behind the rooftops. The cold grew stronger, but Elizabeth didn't move. She was like a lost child, abandoned in a vast city. "It's just temporary," she tried to reassure herself. "Everything can still be fixed." But reality screamed otherwise. She had no money, no friends who could take her in. She had always prided herself on her independence, but now that independence had turned into complete isolation. Sitting on the bench in the fading light, Elizabeth felt not only homeless but useless. And that was the most terrifying part. Elizabeth sat on a bench in the park where those she had once called family had left her. Time seemed to stand still. People walked by, the streetlights softly illuminated her hunched figure, but no one stopped. The cold fall air was slowly but surely creeping into winter. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stay warm, but the internal cold caused by betrayal was stronger. At some point, she felt a gaze on her. Looking up, she saw a figure standing nearby. It was a tall man, wearing a worn-out jacket and a rough scarf around his neck. He looked at her with a mixture of surprise and concern. Elizabeth recognized him immediately. "Miss Carter?" His voice was full of confusion. "Is it really you? What are you doing here?" It was Johnny, one of the homeless people she had once helped. A few years ago, he had stumbled upon her studio, freezing and searching for any warmth. Elizabeth had given him a blanket, a cup of hot tea, and a few kind words. At the time, it seemed like a small thing, but apparently, to Johnny, that gesture had meant a lot. "Johnny?" she replied weakly. "Is that really you?" He nodded and stepped closer, studying her face. His brows furrowed when he saw her condition. "What happened? Why are you here?" he asked, sitting down next to her. Elizabeth sighed deeply. It felt like she no longer had the strength to tell her story, but his caring gaze made her begin. She told him about her nephew, George, who had sold her apartment, and how she ended up on the streets. Johnny stayed silent, listening intently. There was a mix of anger and pity in his eyes. When she finished, he stood up, extended his hand, and said, "Come with me. You can't stay here." Johnny took her to the basement of an old building nearby. It was a place where a small group of homeless people lived. It smelled of dampness, but it was surprisingly warm thanks to old heaters and a stove in the corner. Around her were 5 men and women of different ages. When they saw Johnny with Elizabeth, they fell silent, but he quickly explained, "This is Miss Carter. She once helped me when I was in desperate need. Now she needs our help." Slowly, but with clear respect, the others began to move. One man dragged over an old but still soft mattress, someone found a couple of blankets, and a woman brought a screen to provide at least a little privacy. Elizabeth watched all of this with a mixture of anxiety and gratitude, not knowing how to express her feelings. "We're all family here, Miss Carter," Johnny said, noticing her confusion. "And we take care of each other. Now, you're one of us." Adjusting to life in the basement wasn't easy, but Elizabeth, with her inner resilience, started to find order in the chaos. Her room, a corner separated by a screen, was minimalist, but she did everything she could to make it look neat. Keeping things clean was important to her, even in such humble conditions. Every day, she carefully folded her clothes, washed them when she had the chance, and tried to be helpful to those around her. Elizabeth started helping the other residents, caring for an elderly man who was ill, preparing simple meals on the stove, mending clothes when she found some thread. "How do you do it, Miss Carter?" one of the young women from the basement asked one day. "You always look like you're living in a nice house, not here." Elizabeth smiled. "We can't choose where we end up," she answered, "but we can always choose who we are." Over time, her kindness and wisdom began to attract others. The other basement dwellers respected her and even started calling her Mrs. Carter, emphasizing their regard for her. Elizabeth found comfort in knowing that she could still be useful, even in such circumstances. She began to spend her evenings telling stories from her past. People would sit in a warm circle and listen to tales about her life on stage, the struggles she faced, and how she taught children. For them, it wasn't just an escape from harsh reality, it was a source of inspiration. "Dance isn't just movement," she said one day. "It's feeling, it's passion. And each one of you can find your dance in life, no matter where you are now." Despite the difficulties, a feeling that she thought she had lost forever began to take root in Elizabeth's heart. It was hope. Hope that life, no matter how harsh, could still have its bright moments. Johnny became her loyal friend. He often said that her strength inspired him to change. "You're not just a person, Miss Carter," he said one day. "You're a light. Even here in the basement, you remind me that we can strive for something better." Elizabeth smiled, looking at Johnny, and replied, "We all can be a light for someone, even if it's dark around us." In the basement, which was meant to symbolize defeat, Elizabeth found new friends and a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that this chapter of her life wouldn't be easy, but she believed that something greater awaited her. After all, her heart, as always, remained open to goodness and warmth, and that meant her journey wasn't over. The cool autumn day in Brooklyn dragged on slowly, and Elizabeth felt every minute stretch, as if she had become part of the city's hustle and bustle. She stood at the corner, holding an old plastic cup, begging for spare change outside a local store. The faces of passers-by were focused on their own thoughts and worries, and most didn't notice her. A homeless woman who had lost everything. But then, one glance made her stop. On a bench near the entrance of the store sat a little girl. She was thin, dirty, with clothes that were covered in grime. She looked on the verge of tears, but there was no despair in her eyes. It was the same restless look Elizabeth had seen in the eyes of people abandoned on the fringes of life. Her heart tightened. Elizabeth stepped closer. The girl noticed her and raised her head, looking around cautiously, as if trying to figure out who this woman was and whether she could trust her. Elizabeth crouched down, trying not to scare her. "Hey," she said gently, offering a smile. "Are you feeling sick?" The girl shook her head, but her eyes were still clouded with hunger and exhaustion. "Where's your mom?" Elizabeth asked, trying to understand how she could help this little one. The girl looked at her in confusion, then spoke softly, barely above a whisper. "My stepmom dropped me off here and told me to wait, but she never came back." Those words struck Elizabeth like a punch to the gut. The little girl, defenseless and alone, was sitting on a bench in the cold wind, waiting for someone who had abandoned her. Elizabeth felt her heart squeeze as if fate itself had intervened in this cruel moment. She quickly pulled out all the money she had left and bought food and water for the girl at the nearest store. The girl accepted her help with surprise, as though she wasn't used to anyone caring for her. "You need to come with me," Elizabeth said, taking the girl's hand. "I won't leave you here." Without a word, the girl stood up and followed her. No questions, no objections. She just walked, as if trusting whatever she could feel in that moment. Elizabeth took her to the basement where she was staying. It was warm and cozy compared to the street, although the basement itself was still dirty and damp. But to the girl, it felt like a real safe haven. Elizabeth laid the girl down on an old mattress, carefully tucked her into a blanket, and sat beside her, gently asking, "What's your name, sweetie?" The girl looked up at her warily and replied, "Lily." "Lily," Elizabeth repeated, smiling. "That's a beautiful name. Don't worry, you're safe here. I'll be right here." But despite the reassurance, Lily couldn't sleep. She still sat there, clutching her blanket, her little fists clenched, unable to find peace. Elizabeth sat beside her, feeling she needed to do something more for this girl. She made up her mind that the next day, she would take Lily to the police. The next morning, they went to the nearest police station. Elizabeth, trying to be as gentle as possible, explained the situation and asked for help. But her words seemed insignificant in this large mechanical world, where every day brought new stories of fear and pain. The police took the report, but it was clear that no one believed the poor homeless woman with the little girl. Even Lily, standing next to Elizabeth, didn't look like proof that her stepmother had really abandoned her. One of the officers even asked with obvious doubt, "Are you sure this is true? Why didn't your stepmother leave any contact info?" Lily was silent, her eyes filled with worry, but she couldn't answer. Words couldn't express the pain she was feeling. All this time, Elizabeth could feel the cold despair creeping across her skin. "We just came from the street. This girl was clearly left here," Elizabeth insisted. The officers exchanged glances, but still didn't show any real interest in the case. Although the report was filed, they didn't seem to have any intention of offering genuine help. Elizabeth felt her helplessness grow, and for a moment, she wondered if this girl would become another forgotten, invisible person in this city. No one wanted to notice her. No one believed her. As Elizabeth and Lily were leaving the station, walking past a row of police cars, she could barely breathe. She couldn't leave this girl, but she couldn't figure out how to change the course of events either. Suddenly, at the exit, someone called out to them. They turned around, and Elizabeth felt her heart skip a beat. A man in an expensive suit stood before them. He looked businesslike, but something in his eyes made Elizabeth wary. "Wait," he said, walking up to them. "Isn't this the little girl who went missing a few days ago?" Elizabeth and Lily froze. The man looked at Lily closely, then at Elizabeth, and his face changed. "This is my daughter," he exclaimed suddenly. Lily immediately looked up and recognized him, her father, the man she hadn't seen for so many days. Lily rushed to him, and seeing her, he opened his arms wide. A moment full of surprise and relief passed in silence. "I apologize for everything that happened," the man said to Elizabeth. "My wife really shouldn't have done that. We'll figure this out." He called his wife, and the conversation was brief but determined. Lily returned to her family, and Elizabeth stood on the street, watching as the family reunited. In her heart, she still had a question. What happens to those who can't find their own family? Where do they go to find a home? But at that moment, she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't leave Lily in trouble, and she had done everything she could to bring her home. Elizabeth, feeling the weight of the day's events, was leading Lily down the dimly lit street as they walked out of the police station. Elizabeth's mind was full of thoughts, but she also felt a sense of relief that she had finally done something for the girl. There was warmth in her heart from helping someone, but there was also bitterness. How could she be sure that the system, just like the people around her, wouldn't let her down, leaving her with no hope for help? But their walk was abruptly interrupted by a sharp, unexpected sound. A man in a business suit, carrying a leather briefcase, quickly approached them. At first, he didn't notice Elizabeth, but as soon as his gaze landed on Lily, he froze. Lily pressed her lips together and looked at him with clear surprise, but also with a glimmer of hope that had been missing for days. The man rushed toward her as if he had seen not just his daughter, but the return of his entire life. "Lily, where have you been?" His voice was filled with worry and pain. In response, Lily clung to him, her small arms wrapping around his neck. In that moment, Elizabeth felt how those words became a bridge between two worlds. The world of the girl's pain and fear, who had spent days alone, and the world of the father who had lost his daughter, possibly forever. Michael Brooks, the girl's father, dropped his briefcase and embraced his daughter tightly, but then his gaze turned back to Elizabeth. He froze as if a storm of memories had hit him, then finally spoke. "Miss Carter? Is that you?" Elizabeth didn't immediately understand what he meant, but then she recognized him. Michael Brooks. He had been one of her best students, someone whose determination and passion for ballet had left a lasting impression on her. His dance abilities were exceptional, and she had believed he could become one of the best. But years had passed, and she had nearly forgotten about him. And now, here he was, standing in front of her, not knowing what had happened to her over the years, staring in amazement at the woman who had once been more than just a teacher to him, almost a mentor. "Michael," Elizabeth said with a soft smile, "I never thought I'd see you again. How have you been?" Michael, still holding Rachel in his arms, was clearly stunned to run into an old acquaintance in such an unusual situation. His expression was anxious but also grateful. "Elizabeth, I can't believe it's really you. It's unbelievable that you helped my daughter." His voice cracked. "I've spent years not knowing where she was. My wife and I were so afraid something terrible might have happened to her, and here, you found her. Thank you." Elizabeth felt as if his words were washing away the weight of the past few days. But it wasn't just that. A flash of memories from when she used to teach at her studio and inspired Michael and her other students came rushing back with new strength. Back then, she had been in the prime of her life, full of enthusiasm and faith in youth. Now, the person standing before her had completely changed. He was a father, searching for his lost daughter. And all she could do was help him. "I just did what I was supposed to do," Elizabeth replied, holding back the tears that were welling in her eyes. "I found her and brought her here so she could be safe." Michael looked at her again, his face turning serious. He clearly had something on his mind, something that made him speak with surprising directness. "Elizabeth, you have no idea what happened with Lily. It all started with my wife. I didn't want to believe that she could do something like this, but it wasn't an accident. My wife, she left her like Lily was just some toy, and I didn't even know what to do when it happened." Elizabeth felt her heart tighten. She knew that families had their conflicts, but abandoning a child on the street wasn't just a mistake, it was a tragedy. Lily was a small, innocent being who deserved love and care, not such suffering. "Don't worry," Elizabeth said, seeing how Michael was struggling to keep himself together. "Everything will be okay. I'm sure that with you and your family, the girl will be safe." Michael nodded gratefully, but there was still pain in his eyes. He stood there, holding his daughter tightly, and finally turned to Elizabeth with a plea in his voice. "Please help us. I don't know what to do next. I'm willing to do anything to help Rachel forget this nightmare." Elizabeth felt her heart fill with regret for all those she couldn't save. those who had fallen through the cracks of the system and ended up in tragic situations. But in this moment, she knew she had to help him and his daughter. "I will help, Michael," she said firmly. "But the most important thing is for you to find the strength to talk to your wife. It's crucial. If she was that cruel to your daughter, it cannot go unpunished." Michael's face grew darker, and he nodded coldly. "I know. I won't let this happen again. I'll talk to her, and if I need to, I'll fight for my daughter." Lily, still in her father's arms, finally leaned in and whispered to him, "Dad, I don't want her to leave me again." Michael hugged her tighter and replied, "I won't let that happen. You'll be safe. I promise." Elizabeth, watching the scene, felt that her mission was complete. She had helped Lily return to her father, and now, with the girl safe, she could leave and begin her life again. Despite all the hardships, her life was not yet lost. "Take care," she said with a smile, stepping back. "Everything will be fine. I believe your family can rebuild everything it has lost." Michael thanked her, and with Lily in his arms, they slowly walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Elizabeth remained standing in the shadow of the street, feeling her heart fill not only with bitterness, but also with a light sense of satisfaction. Today, she had done something important. Here's the translation of your text to American English, adjusted to fit the language and tone for an American audience. Michael Brooks silently drove through the dark city streets, his face focused and tense. The car was quiet, with only the soft sobs of Lily breaking the stillness. She seemed unable to believe that she was finally safe in her father's arms. Elizabeth sat next to them, still somewhat in shock at how quickly things had turned around. Just a few hours ago, she had been alone and desperate, and now she was witnessing justice return to a family that had seemed to have lost all hope. Michael didn't say a word until they arrived at his house. When they got out of the car, he didn't hesitate to usher Elizabeth and Lily inside. He left Lily on the couch and turned to face his wife. Lisa Brooks, who hadn't expected such a swift turn of events, was sitting in an armchair in the corner, her hands clenched tightly as she tried to hide her anxiety. "You knew what was happening with our daughter," Michael began, his voice cold but tight with tension, carrying a trace of anger. "You abandoned her, left her on the street. That's unacceptable, Lisa." His wife fell silent, clearly knowing she couldn't defend her actions. But, as always happens when people face the consequences of their choices, she tried to squirm her way out. "That's not true. It wasn't me. I don't know who took her. I was set up. Lily was kidnapped, and I couldn't." Lisa started, but her words just sounded like empty excuses. Elizabeth, sitting nearby, was sure of one thing. Lisa was lying. She couldn't forget the look on the girl's face when she first told her how her stepmother had abandoned her. That look had been full of fear and desperation. There had been no kidnapping. Lily had simply been left to fend for herself, and that spoke for itself. Elizabeth couldn't stay quiet, her voice firm and confident. "It's true, Lisa. You left Rachel on the street. She told us everything, so stop lying." Lisa paled, her face twisted in rage, but there was no longer any confidence in her eyes. She understood that her position was hopeless. Michael stood up, his anger clear, and his words came down like a sentence. "You're leaving this house, Lisa. I can't live with someone who would leave their daughter out there like that. I can't trust you anymore." He pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and after a few seconds he said into the receiver, "I need a divorce. Now." Lisa looked like a trapped animal, but despite all her attempts to justify herself, she knew it was over. Michael was resolute. There was no trace of doubt on his face, only clarity and determination. He had long realized that he couldn't go on living with a woman capable of such actions. He knew that if she could do that to her own daughter, he couldn't expect anything good from her in the future. When the call ended, Michael turned to Elizabeth, noticing the worried look on her face, and gently said, "I'll never forgive myself for not noticing this sooner, for not seeing how she was changing, how her coldness was tearing our family apart. But now I'll do whatever it takes to make sure Lily is safe. I should have done this a lot sooner. You saved her, Elizabeth. Thank you." Elizabeth held back tears. This moment felt strange to her. After all, she had just done what she thought was right, helped a child in need. But hearing the gratitude from someone she once knew as a student touched her heart. I just did what I could. But don't forget, Michael, that Lily will be with you now, and you'll be with her. The most important thing now is being there for her." He nodded and, walking over to his daughter, gently hugged her. "You'll be safe, Rachel. I'll never leave you again." Meanwhile, Lisa silently packed her things, realizing she no longer had a place in this house. She walked to the door, each step feeling like a goodbye to her past. When she finally left, the door closed behind her with a heavy but liberating sound. Despite everything that had happened, the Brooks family began to find its balance again. Michael, having taken responsibility for his daughter, was finally giving her what she'd long deserved: love and protection. And Elizabeth stood by, feeling the bitterness of losing her home and her former life. But at the same time, a sense of satisfaction that she had done everything she could to save the girl. After Lisa had left, Michael turned to Elizabeth again. "I know it's been hard for you. I know you've been through a lot, and I want you to know that you're not alone. You helped me, and now I want to help you. I'll deal with the person who tricked you with the apartment. Your nephew, he's going to answer for everything." Elizabeth felt her shoulders relax a bit, and inside, a sense of gratitude spread. She wasn't alone in this world of betrayal and loss anymore. Now she had support, and maybe, just maybe, she could start a new chapter in her life. "Thank you, Michael," she said, her voice softer now. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Michael smiled. "It's going to be okay, Elizabeth, I promise you. You and Rachel are safe. And I'm not letting you two go." Elizabeth looked at him, feeling her faith in people and justice slowly returning. From this moment on, her future seemed less uncertain. Ahead of them, a new life awaited, full of possibilities and hope. Michael Brooks hadn't let up on the situation with Elizabeth's apartment for a single day. Since their last meeting, his determination hadn't wavered. He knew that his commitment to Elizabeth wasn't just about getting her home back, but about restoring the justice that had been so cruelly broken. He used every connection and resource at his disposal to find evidence of the fraud that her nephew had been involved in. Professional lawyers he hired soon uncovered the necessary documents and exposed the actions that led to the illegal sale of the apartment. The crime was revealed, and the apartment was returned to Elizabeth. When Michael shared the good news with Elizabeth, she felt her heart fill with gratitude and relief. At first, she couldn't quite believe that everything that seemed lost was now back in her hands. But as she looked into Michael's confident eyes, she understood that she was truly home again. "You've given me more than just dance lessons, Miss Carter," Michael said as they sat in his cozy living room. He didn't hide his appreciation, and his words were sincere, filled with respect. "You taught me that it's not always easy to be honest and resilient. You taught me to value what really matters. The principles I live by are, in many ways, thanks to you. I'll always be grateful for that." Elizabeth felt a warmth in her chest as she heard those words. She had always been a strict but fair mentor, and despite her personal losses, she had stayed true to her beliefs, always remembering how important it was to help others, regardless of their social standing. Now, as she stood at the threshold of her home once more, she realized that this wasn't just a return to the past. It was the beginning of something new. Michael continued, "I know coming back home may not be easy for you. I know you've been through a lot. But please don't leave right away. Stay in our home for a while, at least until we sort out the rest of the issues." Elizabeth was touched by his offer, but there was a certain humility in her eyes. She didn't want to be a burden. She had been independent for so long, and accepting help was hard for her. "Thank you, Michael. That's incredibly generous of you, but I'll need some time to adjust. I want to get back to my apartment, back to my life. However, if it's not too much trouble, I'll stay with you for a little while." Michael smiled and nodded with confidence. "No trouble at all. We'll be happy to have you stay. And by the way, I wanted to offer you a job. You could become Rachel's nanny. She's been through a lot, and despite years in various schools, none of them have instilled in her what you once taught me: honesty, hard work, and respect for others." Elizabeth thought for a moment. She had always loved children, and she believed it was important not only to teach them something, but also to give them moral guidance, life principles. But being a nanny, especially in Michael's home, seemed like something that could bring more purpose into her life. "My dance studio taught me a lot," she began, carefully choosing her words. "But what I understood most is how important it is to pay attention to children, to their inner world. To teach them not just to dance, but to love life. I'll accept your offer, Michael." He was pleased by her decision. Michael had always felt that Elizabeth had the wisdom and strength that could help not only in raising his daughter, but in bringing harmony to his home. Rachel, despite her stepmother, was still a child who needed support and care, and Elizabeth was someone who could provide that. Each day, Elizabeth felt her life take on a new sense of purpose. She was no longer alone, no longer teetering on the edge, thinking her future was out of her control. Now, she understood that every loss and every challenge had become stepping stones leading to a brighter future. Sometimes life throws us challenges, testing our strength, but despite all the difficulties, it's important to find the strength to keep moving forward. Elizabeth often thought about those days when she had to live in a basement, begging for change and taking care of Rachel. She didn't regret that time. On the contrary, those moments had taught her to value not only material things, but also the relationships that stay with us when everything else is gone. She wasn't completely alone, despite the seeming hopelessness. In her life, there were people who hadn't betrayed her, who hadn't left her in her most difficult moments. Michael had been there. Rachel was becoming more open and trusting, and her dance studio, though now a part of the past, remained in her heart. Now she could share her love for the arts, not only through dance, but by helping children become the best versions of themselves. Soon, when Elizabeth embraced her role in the Brooks household, a new chapter of her life began. She started training Rachel, and though the girl was still young, Elizabeth saw incredible potential in her. Michael and Elizabeth became good friends, and sometimes even more than friends. Their bond grew stronger, and each day they spent together, supporting each other in this difficult but meaningful journey. For Elizabeth, there was no longer an emptiness in her soul. She had found purpose again, and now her life was full of new opportunities, love, and faith in a brighter future.